Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the New Media Show. My name is Todd Cochran. Of course, I want to welcome you to the show today. Of course, I got my co-host, Mr. Rob Greenlee, on the bottom square this morning. Rob, how are you?
Doing terrific, Todd. Great to be back on the New Media Show, and we have a terrific guest with us, too.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Well, Owen Grover, the CEO of Pocket Casts, the leading podcast listening platform. The Listen to Podcast been around for many, many years, and he's been leading the charge over there for a long time with this very popular podcast listening app, and great to have him on the program. Thanks, Owen.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. Glad to have you on. And I tell you, I'm excited to talk to you because, in all fairness, this is the first time we've actually had an app developer come on. I'm not saying app developer, but an app, what's a better word? Provider.
Listening platform.
Listening platform. Come on and talk to us. So, and I think that Rob and I are, we're getting ready to head out to Podcast Movements Evolutions. I think you're going to be out there too. I'm not sure, but we're getting ready to talk about RSS a lot at Podcast Movement as well. So I think one of the topics I'd like to cover today is your thoughts on podcast expansion or RSS expansion. But let's talk about podcasts first. So for those that don't know, why don't you give them the 411?
So Pocket Cast is, we think, absolutely the best way to listen to all your favorite podcasts. It was the company was founded in Adelaide, Australia, all the way back in 2008. The app was launched in early 2011, and the two co-founders, Russell and Philip, have really been at the forefront of bringing a premium podcast listening experience to mobile apps. When they started doing it, there really weren't any mobile apps that were out there that allowed you to take your podcast with you wherever you went. Podcasts were still at that point really tethered to the desktop experience through iTunes or through web listening. So they have a long experience, a long history of building really thoughtful, really beautifully designed podcast apps for iOS, for Android, for web, Android Auto, you name it. Every platform you can think of. Sonos. We recently launched Amazon Echo Skill. So really, our theory on this is we want to be exactly where podcast listeners expect us to be, with all the features and the services and the affordances that they're looking for. I joined the company back in early 2018 when the founders partnered with National Public Radio, NPR, WNYC, WBEZ Chicago, and This American Life, with the goal of building out a sustainable podcasting platform, not only for public radio, but for independent producers of all stripes. And it's been my real pleasure to work with these guys on growing the platform, building out new business models, developing features, working more closely with the podcasting ecosystem, and generally just improving the app overall for all of our users.
Rob, I know that you've got a lot of thought about things going on in the app space per se. I'm going to go ahead and kick to you.
Yeah. Well, Owen, let's talk a little bit about your philosophy and your app around discovery of podcasts and kind of where you see that area, moving more towards, because I know, Todd and I hear a lot of people talking about that there's a podcast discovery problem, and when you think about that topic, you immediately think, well, what are the listening apps doing to help people discover podcasts? I mean, what's your kind of view on that right now as you look at, you're reaching your customers, with a terrific listening experience?
It's a really great question. When people tell us why they appreciate Pocket Casts, they generally focus around three key areas. The first is we just have a really thoughtful design, great UX. It's really pleasing to look at. It's a fun app to use. It's really feature packed. It's a premium experience. The second thing that they say is they appreciate the fact that we're dedicated to a seamless cross-platform experience. Right? We're not just iOS. We're not just Android. We're not just web. We're not just connected devices. We're all of those things because we understand that this is table stakes thinking into the future. Podcasts should be available wherever listeners expect them to be, and that's on any connected device. But the third thing that they say, and this comes up as frequently as the other two, if not more, is our thoughtful approach to curation. unlike some of the other players in the space, we really dedicate an area inside of the app called our Discover section to curating what we think are the most important, exciting, enjoyable podcasts across a host of different genres. And we built out a team internally that's focused on that kind of curation. Now, from our perspective, podcasting is still such a community-driven and an emotionally resonant medium. We've really taken a human-focused approach to curation. And that doesn't mean that we don't use algorithms, because we absolutely do. What it does mean is that we put people first. We have people listening to all the podcasts before we would ever recommend them. And we take that role that we play very, very seriously. Now, I am not in any way a Luddite. I think that there are lots of different technological frameworks that can be brought to bear to provide better personalized discovery for all listeners. But we also feel very strongly that you can't disintermediate the role of listeners in all of this. And if we're going to recommend something to the folks who use our app, we want to make sure that it has the Pocket Cast's sort of good housekeeping seal of approval.
So what is a Pocket Cast seal of approval for a show? Because I'm sure there's podcasters listening here and say, "Oh, what's the magic sauce for that?"
Well, make a good podcast. We're not looking for a specific genre. What I would say is, obviously, we are focused on new voices, right? So the discovery section shouldn't be a place where you go and find the same 20, 30, 40 podcasts that everybody is very familiar with, right? We have plenty of Joe Rogan listeners in our audience, and they don't need our help in finding shows like that. They need our help, and they expect us to provide them with a lens on, the new voices, the new stories, the new genres that are emerging, right? It's typically the case that our listeners are pretty up to speed on what's happening in terms of journalism, in terms of tech, the stuff that we all have been listening to for 10, 15 years now, right? Those voices are well represented already among our top listened to podcasts. So we see our role in broadening the palette of what we can turn our listeners onto. So we're really focused on, diversity in all senses of the word. We want to see young podcasters taking root and growing. If we can help spread the word about a new voice that we think is compelling, then we're doing our jobs.
I think too, a lot of podcasters are worried today that they're just kind of being lost amongst all the commercial stuff. And, you see this continued, it's just kind of like this undercurrent of discussion where, you hear about the big mainstream shows are coming from Gimlet and Napoli and all all these big media creation houses. And then you have the independent content creators who are just like, all they see talked about are AKA these top level shows. And they're kind of, being that they make up 95% of the podcasting space, or maybe even more, maybe 97%, it kind of sometimes discourages them to hear them say, "I'm just buried. I can't be found."
Right. Right.
And I know that it's good that you're trying to do this, bring new voices to the forefront, but what do you think the split is then on Pocket Cast for indies versus mainstream shows? And
right. Well, I mean, the truth is that as we think about promoting new shows, we're not necessarily more heavily weighting a producer just because they come from a well-funded media network, right, or what have you. Right. We're open to anyone. We have a really wonderful head of curation. Her name is Darian Muka. And if anyone out there would like to submit their podcast for consideration for curation or promotion within our app, you can just email her at Darian, DARIAN, at pocketcasts.com. And she's very good, listens to everything, and is an extraordinary spotter of talent. She's really a key member of the team and really relishes this role. I mean, think about it. It's a job in which you get to listen to great podcasts all day long, work with the top producers in the game, uncover unheard voices, and play the role of helping to bring those voices to our passionate users. Now, let's talk a little bit about Pocket Cast for a second, in all of this. This is not a platform necessarily for casual users. We already know that every iOS device ships with a built-in podcast player, right? And now increasingly, so do Android devices, right? So you're not picking Pocket Casts if podcasts are a third or fourth choice in terms of media consumption, if you'd rather watch a YouTube video or you'd rather listen to music or what have you. Our fans are the medium's most passionate listeners. Our listeners are listening on average 10 hours a week on our apps, right? 10 hours on average, which means that half of them are listening more than that, if you can believe it, right? Yeah. So again, we may not be as big as the Apples or the Spotifys of the world, but putting your content in front of our listeners means that you're getting access to a deeply dedicated, very emotionally invested group of the medium's most passionate fans. And that's what we do. Our focus is on giving them a great experience. And the only way we can do that, right, is by taking great care and demonstrating that we care about promulgating great new storytellers. Because our fans don't need any help finding all the most famous publishers out there. These are super users. We can't tell them what they already know. We need to help them find something great that's new.
Oh, and I think you've hit on something here that maybe a lot of podcasters don't even know. So, I think the last survey results I've seen maybe come out of some of the groups say that the average is like 6 or 7 hours of listening a week. So for you guys, this should be a selling point, going back to podcasters saying, listen, this is why you recommend Pocket Cast to your audience, because people that are using Pocket Cast are listening for as much as 10 hours a week. And that means that, AKA, number one, the chance of them listening to your show is higher because there's just more listening hours happening on the app. Even though you're battling with these juggernauts that are out there, the Spotify and the Apples of the world, and trying to continue to gain market share, but to say that you've got an average of 10 hours, and if you guys can continue to drive that number right, my goodness, that's huge when you come back and telling podcasters, this is why you should promote Pocket Cast on your show.
Indeed. For us, it's critically important.
Owen,
this is, yeah.
No, go ahead and continue. I have a question for you after. Go ahead.
Sure. So, we take that role very, very seriously. And we do love to tell the world about that gaudy stat. And, the thing that we've found that's been incredibly heartening is that in the midst of all this great competition, our usership continues to increase and grow and flourish. And that time spent is very, very stable. I've seen it in the past 6 months be as high as 12 hours a week, 14 hours a week. I think over the summer was our high water mark. So, it is a platform for deeply passionate fans, and we are really excited to interact with any new producers and publishers out there. We don't care whether or not you're doing it in your broom closet or if you're doing it in a well-outfitted studio. What I would say, however, is if you care about the medium, you'll want to support a platform like ours because we're focused first and foremost on growing, right, and cultivating this medium for what it is, not as an add-on, not as a additional feature to filigree alongside of radio streams or alongside of on-demand music or algorithmically curated music playlists. If you care first and foremost about this medium, if you're deeply passionate about seeing podcasting grow and flourish, then we're a great platform to use. And the other thing that happened was back in September, we were a premium app, meaning you had to pay whatever the equivalent is in your area, but in the US, $3.99 to download the app. And we felt very strongly that philosophically that didn't align with our public media partners. Our public media partners are dedicated to free and open access. And so what we did was we switched our business model to make the app downloadable for free. And then we offered I'll call it a premium tier. And then if you like, there's some additional services, new services and features that we put behind a very modest paywall. And you can upgrade, and that helps us drive sustainability. But in so doing, we've made the app available to anyone who's interested, and we've taken away that barrier of the $3.99 for a download.
What's your philosophy around subscriptions versus following? And if you can talk about how that impacts what a common term of churn, right, around people connecting with shows. I used to run a listening platform myself for my content creation side, and I saw a lot of data that showed a lot of churn around people subscribing to podcasts. Are you seeing that on the platform where people are subscribing and unsubscribing and trying new shows on a continual basis? Are there any kind of ratios that you can share with us about what's happening in that area?
Well, what I would say is, obviously we have our own data, and what I'd say is our listeners tend to be quite loyal, and they're willing to try, all sorts of new shows. And our, we tend to have a multiple of the numbers of subscriptions per user than you might see on a more casual platform, where there are less dedicated, passionate listeners. I think at the end of the day, there are two pieces here, which is you got to look at the composition of the audience, right? So what kinds of people are coming into our front door, right? Because we definitely do position ourselves as a platform for heavy, engaged, loyal listeners of podcasts, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing you have to look at is, what kind of stories are you telling and creating the right kind of cadence and developing content that's really compelling. And my taste may be different than yours, and we're going to ask you or offer to you a whole bunch of a diversity of voices and storytelling styles and genres and formats, daily, weekly, fiction, nonfiction, you name it, right? All over the map. And it's just the case that when you offer new things, some of that stuff is going to stick and some of it doesn't, but that's no excuse not to continue to do that with great consistency and regularity. I think that we have users who have used our platform for years and years, right? And some of those folks may have a very good sense of what they're looking for in a podcast. Some of those folks may be interested in trying new things, but we definitely see it as our role not to overthink the different cohorts of users, but to be thinking about the best way to spotlight new content and new voices on the platform. Right now, we can curate based on device, we can curate based on geography, but in order for us to make a really big splash, particularly with the curational affordances that are most visible inside the app, we don't want to slice and dice our audiences too much. If we think a podcast is great, we're willing to put it in front of 100% of our users.
Right. So, but as listeners kind of listen to a show for a while and then they unsubscribe and then they subscribe to a new show, is there any kind of data that you guys are capturing in that to get an idea of what the activity of a typical podcast listener is doing right now around, connecting with shows at that level?
Right.
And I mean, because I saw it back when I was running the Zune podcast platform, it was about 50% a week is what I saw. And I'm just curious if over time we've seen that churn number drop because the quality of content's gone up. I oftentimes have wondered that the reason back in the early days of the medium that I saw such a high churn of 50% a week of subscriptions was because the content quality was kind of all over the map back then. But now I think things have definitely improved. And I just wonder if that if people are sticking with shows longer because the shows are typically better.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about churn for our app, I'm thinking about users of the app. And while, and I want to be really clear because this could spark another 2-hour conversation about PII and data on users and so on. We have not built the app such that we're terribly concerned at all or have any interest in your PII, your sex, your zip code. That's not our model. Our model is not to create a PII file that we then sell to a third-party advertiser or a data collection entity of any sort. That is not the business that we're in. And we can certainly have a philosophical conversation about, what advertisers have come to expect and the unfair, ground rules that have been put in place for many years now by the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. But what I really want to be clear is that in terms of what we look at, we're looking at, is the app attractive to people who listen to podcasts a lot? How do we keep them engaged so that they stay inside the platform, curation being a key part of this? And I don't want anyone to walk out of this conversation thinking I'm looking at individual users and tracking their behavior. I am not.
Right.
That is not what this is about. What we tend to see is our users are quite loyal. So the stat you're asking about, I don't have in front of me, but the churn I'm really focused on is if I get someone into the top of the funnel and they subscribe to a podcast or two, can I keep them engaged and involved in using the app? Am I doing a good job of meeting or exceeding their expectations for what they're looking for in a podcast listening experience? And that's my number one focus.
Sure.
I think getting to Rob's point, though, I look at, having done my show now for 15 years, is that I know that listeners have stayed a couple of years, went away a couple of years, come back for a couple of years, went away for a couple of years. And I've got this long history to be able to know that internally that's what happens. But I think a lot of podcasters would kind of like to know, and I don't think this is something that would really invade your listener privacy numbers, but I think it'd be nice if a podcaster could get some sort of it, because they're just looking for indication. Did I lose 3? Did I gain 5? What's the ratio, or did someone
the ratio of that?
Did someone stay 2 months or 3 months? Because it's real telling to a podcaster if all of a sudden, let's say they do an episode and they cover a topic and they lose 25 subscribers on an app. They're going to go, what did I do? Why did I lose those? And it might give them some insights into being able to say, I need to change this, and change this in my programming so that I'm not having as much churn. And I think from that perspective, you're not really giving any, we lost Rob again. We're not getting any, the other one's set up to auto answer. This one is. But anyway, get,
it's a fair, yeah.
So
I'll answer that. Answer that. So, I think, if I take a step back and I hear what you're saying, two things come to my mind. The first thing is Apple has been the industry leader in terms of promulgation of the medium, and I call them like an absentee landlord, right? They've been at the forefront first with iTunes and side loading onto iPods, and then obviously with the native app that they have standard on any iOS device you buy. That's for several years now. And I think that even going back to the latest update that they made, to the latest big update they shipped to Stats, I think it was in late 2017 or early 2018. I think what I've heard frequently from publishers is, given the amount of throughput that they represent, you don't always have access to all of the data you'd like to see, all of the insights you'd like to see regarding, how your listeners are responding, reacting, churning, as you mentioned. And then and the flip side of that is the server side data you get from hosts also may leave something to be desired. And with Pocket Cast, what we have is we own the last mile.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the reasons that I think the Public Radio Consortium that came together to partner with Pocket Cast was so eager to do that was because owning that last mile in a world where you're competing with multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations is critical. Even if you don't own, a majority of the audience, you still own a very dedicated and statistically significant minority, and that data can be quite directional and useful. And I do think it does make sense because we do have, I would call it consumption data rather than PII. We do have consumption data, and there certainly are ways that we can think about productizing that consumption data in a way that might be useful and helpful to our publisher partners. And I hear you loud and clear. I think part of it is understanding better specifically what people are looking for. Because the stuff that we can easily pull right now without any, sophisticated data science, is the basics, right? Like how long on average did people listen to this episode? Did they subscribe or unsubscribe? How many total subscribers did you gain? Since the last episode or during that last period of time. And I don't know right now whether or not that represents any greater sophistication than what's already available to publishers out there. And I wouldn't want to take our team. We're small, we're nimble, but we're very powerful. But focus when you're running a startup is paramount. So I would want to understand really, really well. Okay, so if we're going to play a role as a smaller but very dedicated and very influential partner, what are we building that's actually of value? How is that value then distributed across the network of our publisher partners, right? And how does that help us in the long term become a more sustainable, more stable, more growth oriented platform? Because at the end of the day, right, we've got to find a way to to make this business work on its own terms. We famously have not taken any VC money, right? We had the opportunity to do so. We worked with some really lovely investors in the space. This is not an anti-VC screed by any stretch of the imagination, but we made a philosophical decision to eschew that money because what we were trying to build here was something that was for the public interest, right? So storytelling, right? A platform that exists around storytelling, journalism, voices, right? Independent producers, public media producers in the public interest, right? And so in so doing, we've made decisions to be focused and lean, right? So this is a very long-winded way of saying,
sure.
Tell me what you think is needed, and let's figure out if there's a business there that makes sense for everybody.
Yeah, and I think too, it may segue into another conversation that has been churning at the kind of on the undercurrents a little bit, is about privacy of listeners.
Right.
And I'm a big advocate of privacy of listeners. I think we have enough data already. We know, first of all, as content creators, we know who our audience is because we're talking to them, and we know who's listening because they're listening to our type of content. We should know our listeners. And then doing some basic stuff on our own with some demographic surveys. You don't need a lot to be able to say this is who my audience is. Yet we're beginning to start to go into a stage now where the commercialization of the space is continuing to increase, and people are coming in and says, we want more, we want more, we want more. And do we want to go down the road of, we're on Facebook today. We've all given permission for Facebook to suck everything we put in there and personalize it. And I was actually kind of laughing because I was thinking about buying a trench coat yesterday. I was just thinking about it, but I got an ad today on Facebook for a trench coat. So somehow they read my mind. But it is kind of spooky. So, yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, did I speak trench coat out loud anywhere? But anyway, so we've already given permission to Facebook and Google and Apple to collect data on us. But do we continue to push and do we invade the privacy of our listeners? And I've got a big concern about that. If they say yes, you can take the information from us. Okay, I'm great. That's fantastic. I'm a data guy too, but they don't have a way to say yes, right?
Well, that's a good question.
I think
for Owen here is, does it make sense for a listening platform like Pocket Cast to have an opt-in for that kind of stuff?
I mean, it's certainly something that we've discussed and looked at. But I think philosophically, the place that we're coming from, and it's really important because we've got to start with some core principles, right? That you really embrace and that you stand for. And one of those principles is one of the beauties of this medium is traditionally and even up until now, it has not required the abdication of the kind of invasive private information so typical of other platforms, right? And that isn't a bug, it's a feature, right? Brand marketers have said, well, we would love to get more involved in podcasting, but these tech monopolies, the FANG companies have gotten us accustomed, right, to getting all of this PII and being able to slice it and dice it however we want to better market our wares. And I happen to be in the camp of, hey, I lived in the digital media space for many, many years. I mean, I did, I think, my first digital music startup in the late 90s, right? And I helped to create this platform that I'm sure you're all familiar with called iHeartRadio. You can look it up. My name is there. It's true. And so I lived that life and I've been in those worlds. And, in every one of those steps that I took, I really felt strongly that we were doing something that had a really clear and obvious consumer benefit. But at a certain point along the lines, the cat got out of the bag in a really profound way. And I think it created unreasonable and unfair expectations on the part of brand marketers. Now, of course, getting brand marketers involved in podcasting means that it's a rising tide that'll lift all boats, a lot more money in for producers, monetization options. And by the way, that shouldn't be the only way that this medium gets monetized. And those unfair expectations do not need necessarily to apply to this medium, right? And so our founders, Russell and Philip, who are terrific, wonderful, thoughtful, bright, effective developers, smart strategists, we wouldn't be working together if we didn't philosophically agree on this tenet, which is that if you don't have to collect the data, you shouldn't collect the data. And in as much as you are collecting data, it should be very, very clear to the user what they're being asked for, why, and what benefit it gives them. There's just too much data collection that happens without the consent or without any sort of value proposition being clearly articulated to users. And I don't care. Look, I'm on Instagram. I try not to spend too much time on Facebook, but I'm on Instagram so I can post pictures of my family or a concert I go to or something like that, or a great podcast event that I attend. And it's fun. And I'm not here to decry these platforms. I'm there to say that the beauty of the medium is that it doesn't require that we abdicate any of this stuff. And why wouldn't we want to protect that? Why would we be in a race to meet these platforms that have so clearly betrayed the public interest? We're having conversations every day about how Facebook and similar platforms have coarsened, not only the kinds of conversations and our political culture, but have in some ways undermined our democracy, undermined and manipulated people. And that's not what we want from this medium. This medium has so many benefits that, in fact, countervail those trends that we've seen across social platforms. And so we should be very, very ruthless in protecting those areas because they make the medium special, unique, and differentiated.
Oh, and you and I are going to be good friends. So,
but yet, why are we seeing so much pressure in the medium to jump on board? It must be just all about there's more money there, right?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. That's part of it.
And if is there more money there? Is my question. I'm not 100% convinced that there's that much more to make it worth it.
It's a good question. I don't pretend to know. Here's what I do know from my past life is that if you talk to brand marketers and you talk to the digital agencies and the broader brand agencies that represent them, they have been fed a lot of data from a lot of different sources over the past 10 years, right? And they've come to expect. Now, just because they've come to expect doesn't mean if the product is as good as we believe it to be, and I mean podcasting generally, not just our product. We love our product.
Sure.
Podcasting is such a great product, such a compelling product, such a compelling experience for listeners, right? Such an emotionally resonant storytelling methodology, right? And a way to reach people where they are with deep, engaging storytelling, right? Guess what? That's why brand marketers want to be involved, not because you can overlay data sets on top of it. And as you said, Todd, quite rightly, there's a lot you can know by being in conversation with your listenership.
Yep.
Right? Most of what we know about our Pocket Cast listeners comes because they tweet at us. There's a subreddit. They leave us reviews in the App Store. They write us hundreds of emails a day. I think what's really funny is the support requirements of Pocket Cast at our size, which is, we're substantial, but not, we're not the size of Apple or Google or so on, are similar in size and scale to the support requirements that we had at iHeart, and I knew the numbers there and I know the numbers here. I mean, iHeart was a much bigger platform, but it speaks to the level of engagement and passion and enthusiasm that the medium elicits from the listeners, right? So if we're seeing the same number of emails and tweets, roughly that I would see at iHeart, which was, many times larger as a digital platform, that tells you something.
And I think too, as podcasters, maybe, and I've just, this is just rough polling. There's no science behind it at all. It's just kind of like, hey, what do you think? And I think we see now even content creators are 50% on the fence on this information on PII on listeners. And To me, that kind of surprises me just a little bit. But it's just the time that we live and the changes that we're in. And people say, "Well, I'm being collected everywhere else. What's the difference now?" I don't necessarily take that tack. But from our perspective, and I know Rob's company as well, is we're concerned about it. And in fact, I'm right in the middle now. I'm negotiating out some licensing agreements with some attribution companies, because if a podcaster or creator says, we're just a hosting company, and if a content creator that owns his show says, yes, I want attribution tracking, that should be his choice, and he should be able to go and say, yes, I sign up for that. I'm good with it. But a lot of podcasters just don't know that data is already being collected, and I think they have a right to, and sometimes some of that stuff is buried deep in terms of services. So I was real happy when more than a year ago, I think you guys came out and said you weren't going to support RAD, which I think a lot of us talked about that a lot because of your investor or part owner or whatever that relationship is. That just told me right there's the culture of Pocket Cast, because that just laid it out right there. It's like, whoa, they're not going to employ RAD. That was quite a statement.
Yeah. I mean, look, here's what I'd say. A lot of the heavy lifting in the space around conversation around privacy has been done by, folks much more influential than me. I think about sort of the constant conversation and the thoughtful approach that someone like Dave from Basecamp, CTO Basecamp, who's a longtime podcaster and creator of Ruby on Rails and tweets at DHH. At DHH, and he's been banging that drum pretty loudly. I know Marco at Overcast, which is in many ways, very comparable to our app in terms of the kinds of audiences that he attracts, has been very loud about it. I'm not the kind of guy that's going to bang a drum and call people evil. I understand why podcasters or producers or networks would like to have access to more information to help them make better content and programming decisions, to help them understand their audiences, to help them monetize. Everybody here needs to, put food on the table. Yep. So I'm not sitting in judgment. I have a point of view, and I don't feel the need to, to scream and yell. And I totally understand why RAD might be important to NPR. And again, I'm going to say something that may seem like I'm playing counter to the role you've just given me, but NPR is a public media platform, right? And when they're talking about sustainability, they're not talking about profit making. They're talking about, are they able to reach listeners who then may become members? And by the way, you don't become a member of NPR. You become a member of a member station. Right. So their approach to data collection comes from a vastly different place, and people should understand that. It is unfair to sort of lump them into the same sort of bucket in terms of their goals, their aspirations, and their motivation, right? As you would a corporate profit-making entity that's in the business to build a new ad tech layer. And needs the data, or else their business model will fall over. This is about the sustainability of the public media ecosystem. And so, our decision on RAD back then was not driven by some notion that we thought, oh boy, they have the wrong, they have the wrong notion, they have the wrong motivations. Not that at all, right? It's that we were making changes to our platform, and we needed to hold our users' hands through that. And what we didn't want to do was implement a whole bunch of different changes that wouldn't be comprehensible nor explicable to users who had been with us for years and years. And that in order to put anything like that into our app, A, we would want it to be opt-in, and B, we'd want a chance to explain to listeners why we were making this a part of our ecosystem, a part of our app ecosystem.
And I think, too, just so those that are not clear, RAD was not about collecting personal identifiable information. It was just...
That's right.
It was about collecting when you stop, when you play, when you scrub the head. Right. So just so everyone understands, and we were...
It's a different conversation.
It's a different conversation.
That's right.
And we were supporting RAD. So I'm not saying that again, we're data junkies, but we're just making sure that from our perspective is that as long as there's no PII, I think I'm good with collecting anonymized data. But now we're dealing with GDPR, we're dealing with CCPA.
That's right.
We got a whole bunch of other stuff going on there, and there's a whole complexity to that. So I don't know. We killed a dead horse here on privacy. Maybe we can. I don't know, Rob. Can I move this conversation along to expansion of the space and adding new things?
Yeah. Let's definitely move it on. And find out how Owen's thinking about RSS as you look to the future. And is there something that he'd like to see happen that could be maybe more customizable to his platform? I don't know, Todd, go ahead and ask anything you want to ask.
I think what Rob and I together, we've kind of come up with, there's always the discussion, what's next? How do we take podcasting to the next step? And anytime someone starts talking about doing something out of RSS, my alert radar goes off, and I get very, very scared that we're putting people into, when this space started in 2004, it was truly a double finger, the man. We are not participating. We're not going to be controlled. We're not going to allow gatekeepers. This was truly how the space got started. So because RSS is open and the space has remained open and anyone can join, it doesn't, you got someone now in 5 minutes can sign up for an Anchor account and be recording a show. This space has changed completely, and it's completely open to anyone to doing a podcast. And that's why we see diversity groups. That's why we see women and men of color, all these groups coming in and creating content. It's really, really exciting. So whenever I hear someone say we need to change podcasting because RSS is limiting, I'm like, okay, what's your financial objective? So Rob and I are discussing, and we're going to have a meeting at Podcast Movement Evolutions where we're going to talk about expanding with tags and elements within the existing RSS 2.0 spec. What can we add that will bring benefit not to just a network? How can we help the app developers bring new cool features that they can implement on their side that's going to benefit the audience? Because we want to grow, right? We want to grow audience. What can we do to grow audience? So this is a very hard thing. This is going to be like herding cats to the 100th degree, because we have to understand that everyone's got an agenda. Everyone. Doesn't matter how they come to the table. They have an agenda. So how do you weigh what is a benefit for all and not run into, and make sure we keep the space open and not, and so everyone has a bunch of ideas. So I'm just kind of curious. If you had a magic wand and you could say, I wish I could improve this, and this, and maybe you haven't gave this some thought, so this is unfair, but what would you like to do to expand RSS?
Well, I mean, look, I think the first thing I would say is, because, you didn't ask me the first question, which is, do I want RSS versus something else? Yeah. So let's start with the fundamentals.
Okay.
So the first thing is my philosophy on this stuff is this technology is by itself not a strategy. Technology is a tactic,
right,
in pursuit of a strategy, right? Mm-hmm. And so our strategy, right, is to appeal to the medium's most passionate fans, right? But our values, right, that undergird our strategy are about free and open ecosystems, right? That we are deeply committed to free and open ecosystems. One of the first questions. So the reason I'm in this role right now is because of someone I admire very, very, very deeply, very, very strongly. And so I'm going to do a name check. Laura Walker, who ran New York Public Radio for 24 years and is the executive responsible for the rise of podcasting. In terms of turning people on to storytelling and thinking about how podcasting could be discrete from just radio storytelling. I think of her as being really instrumental, working with Chad and Robert over at Radio Lab and growing that. And so I have a lot of admiration for her and her public service and all the great work she did for the 24 years she ran that group. She brought me in, and one of the first questions she asked me in the summer of, I guess it was 2017, she said, "Hey, I'm really thinking about putting together a coalition and so on." And, one of the folks I worked with very closely is now at NPR, and we have a friend in Chicago, and we're thinking about doing this thing. And, what's your take on this, build versus buy? And the second question she asked me was, should we do something that's just focused on the public media sort of content that's coming out, the public radio content, or should we think about open ecosystems here? And I said, you have to think about open ecosystems. It's really clear because you can't explain the difference to an end user, first of all, right? Why would they only see one kind of content versus another, right? And if you're trying to grow the medium and there's so much upside, we have to imagine that the best thing that we can do in our role is to educate people about how great the medium is, right? And you have to do that in partnership with the diversity of content creators. And that when you close these walls off, what you're doing, right, is you're trying to aggregate a lot of the value into one corner, Luminary. But I mean, you could say the same thing about Spotify in their own way for very different reasons. And that this open ecosystem, and by the way, she agreed with me. This open ecosystem philosophy underpins everything that we do. And right now, to get to answering your question, what is the best technological framework to support an open ecosystem approach? Well, that's RSS. It's clear, right? Could we be using JSON? Yes. Okay. But what kind of dislocation, what kind of disruption, what kind of value destroying for both producers and users would there be in order to migrate this universe from one technological framework to another and think about all of the value? And I'm thinking about value not in terms of money. I'm thinking about companionship. I'm thinking about, the emotional benefits of the medium. I'm thinking about the ability of storytellers to reach audiences and touch them and interact with them and so on. Like, that's the value I'm thinking of being destroyed, right? Data migrations, as it is, even simple ones, are rivers of blood, right?
Yes.
I know you both know this. I've been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
And it's all
that's the first question.
Retooling and updating the software to make changes to support different types of frameworks. It just, is there enough value? And that's the question I keep asking. Is there enough value there to justify any kind of a change like that? And that's where Todd and I came to this conclusion that if there's improvements that need to be made, then let's make the improvements the RSS2 spec.
And we're not talking about changing anything. We're talking about adding to
enhancing.
But it will not be successful. This effort, as I've told this group from the beginning, and there's probably 100 people on a Slack channel that's talking about this. I said, this will not be successful unless we can get the app developers to say, this is cool, let's support it. Because in the end, they're listening.
That's right.
They're listening here.
Last mile.
That's right. And if it doesn't get there, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I can add some features that makes my directory more cool, and I can do a few things to but if we can't get it here, I don't even want to start. Be honest with you, I don't want to start the conversation because I understand the uphill battle. When we introduced Subscribe on Android, which Pocket Cast supports a number of years ago, just to make it easy, just to click an Android to get an app to launch and bring up a show to be able to subscribe to have the same function as Apple Podcasts. It took me 2 years to get 13 apps to support that. And so that was one, and it was like 8 lines of code, and we gave the code away. I mean, to just cut and paste in your app and you're good. And I'm simplifying, it's probably more complicated than that. But if we're going to make changes and add stuff to RSS, I got to have at least Marco, you guys. I got to have the top 10 apps say, yeah, that's cool. This is worthy. It's good for the listeners. Add it. And because if you say, yeah, we'll put that on the dev schedule 3 years from now, it's not worth it. Yeah, it doesn't work.
It's never going to get built if it gets put on your dev schedule 3 years from now.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, my response to sort of what I'd like to see is, we would put this very much through the lens of, what creates the highest listener benefit and prioritize thus, right? Because it's always about, how do you make the experience of the user richer, deeper, more satisfying, right? If you're doing that, you're incentivizing producers to create something of value. But I think that's the first prism. The second prism, obviously, is how do we help producers become more independent, more successful, more sustainable, and so on. So those are the two prisms I would always approach this problem through. So that's my way of saying I don't have an answer, but I would look at it through those prisms. And I think there is another piece to this as well, which is that we should be very mindful of some of the existing features and functionality that already exist inside of these specs that have not been broadly adopted. I have a really wonderful anecdote for you, which is that I got a call from one of these really well-funded, high quality producers who we work with closely all the time. Good people, good storytelling, nothing to complain about. These people are in it for all the right reasons. They happen to have had a nice exit. God bless. So they're calling me and they're saying, hey, we want you to fix chapter support inside your app. And I go, we already support chaptering inside the app. I don't understand. Well, we use this host and monetization platform, and because of DAI, it breaks the chaptering support.
That's right.
I think I told Rob. I think I told Rob the story already. And so I turn to the person and I say, well, it sounds to me like you should have a conversation with your host.
That's right.
No, they're not going to prioritize it. So we're hoping that you can build a workaround for it. Remember, it's not broken on our side.
Right.
So just think about perverse incentives, right? The producer for whom this host and monetization mechanism is a vendor. They pay them money. Couldn't get the vendor that they pay to fix the problem. So they're coming to us where it's not broken
to do a workaround.
Correct. So before we start, and again, you have to push the state of the art forward. So this is not me saying, no, don't do anything to RSS 2.0. No, this is me saying, let's be mindful of, the facts on the ground now, because it's one of those things where, there's some weird perverse incentives and strange stuff happening already with really good features that already exist that don't get served.
And I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think that I think you and I agreed to that point. And, there was all kinds of crazy ideas that were put in. I'm looking at those. I'm like, agenda.
Yeah, sure.
No.
Yeah.
So, and hey, I'm a podcast host CEO. I've got agendas, right? But I'm also a content creator, right? So I'm also wearing two hats. I have to think about, okay, we got to build listeners. Listeners this is what's going to drive the space, going to make space more monetizable. It's going to pay bills for people, get donations, whatever model you have. Right. We have to build more listeners, and we have to also, like you said, think about the tools and giving podcasters viable data back that allows them to make better content. And I think that's a big part of this too. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how the meeting goes. And there's, this is just, again, kind of exploratory. And if we end up with 100 cats going 5 different ways, maybe it's not going to work. But we're going to try, and we'll see what happens.
Well, Todd,
no doubt you'll try.
Yeah, I think as a host, we're kind of sitting in the middle of this relationship, right, between the content creators and the listeners, which the app creators on the listening side kind of control access to the listeners as well. So we have this as hosts, we have a very important role in this. But I also want to ask Owen too about, should a lot of these potentially new features that we would maybe want to extend into RSS, do a lot of those ideas need to come from the listening platforms or yourself, right? And how might we be able to elicit that feedback more from the listener side or the app or the technology layer at the at your end of the spectrum? I mean, should we have some way of doing that as an ecosystem where any changes need to come from you down into this particular group, and I would love to have you maybe speak at our meeting at Podcast Movement to talk about this topic too, of trying to get more of the listening apps engaged in this conversation.
Well, we're certainly open to having the conversation. We do not think of ourselves as the keepers of any, baroque, inaccessible information. We see ourselves as part of one piece of the value chain, and we're relatively humble about our ability to predict the future. I'm not a big fan of future prediction. I am a big fan of carefully paying attention to, the wants, the needs, the requests of our users, right, and of users of the medium more broadly. So I think that we have to be careful to not engineer something that doesn't speak to the lived experience of listeners. And I'll give you an example of that. We were approached just the other day by someone who wanted to create a third tab, right? You've got the play screen, then you've got show notes, and they wanted to create a third tab, which was almost like an interactive timeline of content connected to triggers inside of the feed. And so they mentioned a piece of music, and then they mentioned a video, and and there's this beautiful, wonderful, and I'm like looking at this thing and I'm going, wow, that's a lot. And, if I didn't know more, if I hadn't been in the app business since 2008, I might have thought to myself, gee willikers, guys, who wouldn't love that? And then I remembered that I know how apps get used by men and women.
Right.
I hit play. I find the podcast I want. It goes in my pocket.
Right.
In your pocket.
And then I don't take it out again until either that program, right? So we just, again, I people who don't come from the space, particularly people who don't come from audio, are always in this place, not always, but often in this place of being very jealous of the mediums that require that you do this.
Right.
Right. And what's beautiful about podcasting, what's beautiful about it is I can walk my freaking dog and not get run over.
Yeah.
I can do the dishes. I can go for a run. I can be on the train. I can be even reading a magazine. I can be doing all sorts of different things.
Right.
Right. And with this story as my companion, if we forget that key insight, we're lost.
We're done.
We're lost.
We're done.
Right. That's a value.
Sorry that I'm being emotional about it. But I'm like, I just want people to say, like, well, how do you listen to a podcast? Is there solutions in search of problems? Right. God bless them all.
Right.
And I hate, I don't want to ding on chapters, but it's the same thing. I understand people find value in chapters, but I'm saying, well, most people are just sticking the phone in their pocket or purse,
or
they're using this.
Right.
Right. They're not even
tiny screen on it.
So, and we're here, it's not here. So yeah. And for those of you that are listening, I just put my hand in front of my eyes. So,
and when I said that we're not doing this, I put the phone up to my face,
right?
Which is something that you don't generally see people doing when they're listening to a podcast. These are again they are not bugs.
Yeah.
They're not problems to be solved about the medium. They are the features and benefits of the medium, and we should protect them with everything that we have.
So,
but anyway, Rob, I just wanted to address Rob.
Sure.
I was supposed to speak on a panel Friday evening at Podcast Movement with the lovely, talented, brilliant Sharon Taylor from Omni Studios. I have to be, unfortunately, with my parents that weekend. So because of the lateness of the panel, I had to bow out, which I'm very sorry to do, because I would love to see all of you guys out there. And of course, it was my pleasure to do anything where she was associated with it, because she's a firecracker and brilliant. So I won't see you guys there. But that doesn't mean I don't want to be involved, and it doesn't mean I don't accept your offer, to be part of any working group that you guys want to put together. So you can certainly count me in on that front.
What's funny is Marco, you spoke to Marco earlier, he joined the group, and Marco has the ability to, how should we say it, when someone comes up with an idea, he is very direct. He takes his pen out or his
keyboard.
He just, and he very poignantly says, why do I need that? Well, that's why, and he asks questions, because we have these grandiose ideas, and he says, why do we, what is the benefit? And so it's good, because me as a host would like 2 or 3, 4, 5 different things. And you as having listening app, you want 2 or 3, 4, 5 different things. They're obviously going to be different. And then sometimes, again, do we really need it? And if we don't need to mess with the ecosystem, we don't mess with the ecosystem. We leave it alone. And, or if we find one, and I tried to tell the group, let's find 3 things. 3, because they were coming up like this. Let's have a top 10 list. I said, if we can get 3 implemented, that would be great. But we'll see.
That's actually a lot to get implemented.
Well, yeah,
3 is a lot.
3 is a lot. Yeah.
3 is a lot. 3 is like a stretch goal. 1 is like a good outcome.
And they wanted a list of 10, and I'm like, even my dev team, if I said, here's 10 new elements that we have to support, I'm going to get the look like, come here, we need to have a meeting.
Yeah. It's really good that people like that Marco are involved, because he comes at it from the developer perspective, and he's such a talented engineer and product guy. And I have worked my entire career alongside of engineers. I'm not an engineer. I know just enough to be dangerous, and so it's always good. I mean, my take on this is, I'm not in it to tell people that they're wrong. I'm just here to try to remind people about what's special, unique, and differentiated about this medium and why we care about it. And as long as we keep that in the center point of our target, we should be fine, right? I think that, as you see with some folks who are involved in startups, although this is not always the case, and some folks who are involved in, deep-pocketed, new entrants into the scene, what often the mistake that they made is they don't have the same kind of reverence and appreciation for the medium. Maybe they don't listen enough, or maybe they haven't sort of given enough thought to why we care so much about storytelling, in this format, that has come to us in this way, right? And the medium in some ways is the message. The way we listen, the reasons that we listen, the space that it takes up in our lives, the emotional benefits that are associated therein, that's the message, right? That's what we're trying to protect. And then there could be any kind of set of storytelling and storytellers and formats and periodicities of content publishing and so on. But it's less about those kinds of innovations, and it's more about the fact that this is of great emotional value to us in a world where it's clickbait headlines and screaming and yelling and flame wars on social media. Isn't it great to be able to take 20 minutes or 40 minutes or 2 hours and go really in depth on something that interests you or that you care about or that resonates with you in some way, shape, or form? And that's what we need to protect.
Yeah. I try to listen to 100 new shows every 2 weeks. I don't always get it done. And I try to keep notes, and, I use some tools to do that. But some shows, it's just, it's the full variance. And I listen to everything. And it's, if you can hold my attention for 15 minutes, I've been listening to 100 shows. You're pretty good. You've made an impression on me, and I'll listen all the way through. But a lot of shows lose me at the first 2 or 3 minutes. And I think if we can get podcasters to understand, those that are creating content out there, that, listen to a lot of podcasts that are good podcasts, you'll become a better podcaster. And I don't know, I'm kind of off topic here a little bit, I guess, but I think my point is there's just something there for everyone. And
That's right.
On the most obscure, and the beauty of it again is there's no entry. There's no barrier to entry and no gatekeeper. As long as there's no gatekeepers in the space, I'll remain very, very happy to my dying days.
Well, let me turn this back around on you guys, since you guys are both, let's take your podcast hat off for a second. Let's talk about you guys from the Blueberry and Libsyn perspective. So gatekeepers, right? So you could argue that Spotify could very easily become, or has become, a kind of gatekeeper, and they have a little bit of a mixed model, right? And what I mean by mixed is they do allow people to submit feeds, right? But there's also a whole lot of content that they host, right, on their platform, not the traditional RSS model, but literal hosting of content on their servers served from their backend into their apps. And how do you think about the relative risk versus payoff of access to their captive audience versus their very open, at least they're not trying to lie about it, desire to kind of corner the market, and the way that they can achieve the right kind of market dynamics and economic outcomes is for them to control as much of the value chain as possible. And they're not lying about it. They're being really honest about it. So how as hosts, how do you think about the trade-offs there? Because do you worry that they use the open nature of the ecosystem? And now I'm leading the question a little bit. Just to the point where they have a center of gravity big enough where they can pull the rug out from underneath us.
Well, if you look at what they did, is they're very tactical, and I think they maybe didn't realize what they were. Maybe they figured out as they were going, but they made a partnership with Libsyn initially and got this groundswell of shows that wanted to be in. there was this whole ecosystem of shows they couldn't be in because of this exclusive relationship. Then they opened the gates to 8, 9, 10, 12 of us. And then they allowed that group of people. And then there was still some people that were de-enfranchised because they're either their host or they were self-hosting or whatever. And then they add the third part where they could self-submit and be part of the platform. So they built this super desire by podcasters to be on the platform. But so I have a very wide work base. I have Gen X, millennials in my workforce. And how do you listen to podcasts? And I have people on my team that listen on Spotify. I have people that listen with traditional podcast apps. And I think from my perspective, and regardless of what Spotify is doing from a business standpoint, of course, this is this unfair question because my roots are in, I don't care where they listen as long as they listen. But Rob, I guess, and there is this relationship that we're having with them because we talk to them almost on not maybe email almost every day because of copyright infringement and everything else that goes on. If people are putting music in their shows and they're getting bounced off the platform, blah, 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 all that. So if the podcasters want to be there, and if the podcasters want to be there, we have to support it.
Do you feel you have a role to play in educating them about potential risks down the road?
Yes, and I've also been very direct with Spotify too. I've had private meetings with them and had frank conversations. Now, they can take my input and take it for what it's worth. And our podcasters, but I don't know. I don't want to be the old curmudgeon and say, you have to be careful. I don't know, Rob, what do you think about this? I don't know. Maybe I'll step back.
Well, I don't think that that what Spotify is doing is really that much of a risk to the medium. First of all, just for the simple reason is that no one can capture the open nature of the podcasting space and control it. I think a lot of folks that are fairly new to it think that they can. I would put Spotify in that area. But if you really back up and you look at the big picture of it, even an Apple can't do it. The largest companies in the world, they just can't contain this. It's not something that is, I don't think, going to ever be successfully converted into dominated and controlled by a proprietary platform in its entirety. And I think Spotify can try. They can post stuff on their platform, and also make it available off their platform. But at some point, there is going to be pushback from external distribution off of Spotify as they push harder into that area. There is a potential at some point that Apple could choose not to take content from Spotify, or you guys could choose not to take content that's hosted on Spotify for competitive reasons. So, I think that there is a natural balance that will happen. That will keep this medium more open.
But with that, if we look at the numbers, the gains on just basic iOS continue to increase, and the Spotify numbers. So what Spotify's we as on the creator hat, we should be doing backflips. They're bringing in a massive number of new listeners,
right, exactly,
to the space. That is,
but they're not going to control it. That's the key question.
No,
right.
And
they've got 210 million captive users, and they're turning some of these people on to podcasting. And these people were primarily music listeners, and so for them, the medium is still quite new. Yeah. And in as much as they can convert those listeners, that should be good for podcasting writ large. Mm-hmm. And I think Rob gave a pretty interesting and I think compelling rebuttal to worries about them trying to close the drawbridge, as it were.
The bigger concern I have, and I don't know your guys' infrastructure, but many of the listening apps are wholly and completely dependent upon Apple for their directory listing.
Oh yeah,
yeah, I'm very aware of that.
And and again, agenda time. So just being straight up, I've got 800,000 shows in a directory that we have APIs that can be used to populate apps and update them and so forth. So I'm not worried. I know that if Apple ever pulls the plug, my phone's going to explode. That's cool. We're here and we're ready. But at the same time, I'm hoping that app developers, Pocket Cast, everyone included, will have their own mechanisms of discovering, because there's a lot of stuff. I'm going to tell you, we go and troll everywhere. There's a lot of stuff that is not in Apple Podcasts that is, I've got about 40,000 shows that are not in Apple Podcasts, but are active podcasts that aren't in any app unless someone manually adds them. So I think that, and they probably do get added, when people find a show and they add it to their list or manually add it. But I just hope that the app developers don't become wholly dependent upon Apple.
I'm sure that every app developer at scale is thinking about this, and you can rest assured that we not only are thinking about this, but have already taken very clear action to mitigate that potential risk. So I'm not going to come on here and speak to specific.
And I'm sure that risk is very tiny. It would be to their detriment to shut that down.
I will tell you this. Interestingly, it's another funny anecdote, and sort of like, I don't mind a grand gesture every now and again. I'm not a yeller and a screamer, but I don't mind a grand gesture. Last year at Hot Pod, I sat on a panel and Nick asked me a question about, what's the place that a Pocket Cast had? This is again a year ago already. What place could a Pocket Cast or a Breaker or a Overcast, what could you possibly have in this day and age? And I made my my strong emotional statement about the medium's most passionate fans, and putting podcasts first, and so on and so forth. But I also said, look, Google is on version 3 or 4, depending on how you're counting, of their attempt to do this, and I still see links for Google Play everywhere and all over the web, and and again, I know that they're trying to do it, but if you know anything about Google, you know that they always have multiple teams working on the same problem in silos, blah blah. Everyone knows this about Google. That's just how they love that controlled chaos element. And I mentioned with Spotify. I mentioned something about Spotify. I mentioned exactly what you just said, that Spotify is bringing more attention to the industry, and we should all welcome that. And then I said, and Apple has played the role of absentee landlord. They've been the industry leader for a long time, and we appreciate all that they've done. And they've sort of they've been somewhat passive. And it went to question and answer time, and Steve Wilson asked the first question. And you know what he asked me? He said, "Is Pocket Cast still using the Apple API?"
Oh, of course, right? Yeah.
So that to make your eyeballs go big.
That was a year ago. So trust me, we've had our conversations since then.
Well, Rob and I have been talking about this for 5 years, so welcome.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Todd. I don't think they would do that. I think it's against brand for them to do something like that. But I'm just saying, Steve asked me the question.
So just so you know, if you want to back up, we've got an API.
By the way, I think our friends at Acast have a backup. I think there are a lot of people out there who are thinking about it.
So, right. But if we think about Apple, though, well, look what they're doing. I think they have woke up.
Sure, I agree.
We've seen some activity here in the last 9 months or so that says Apple has taken notice of what Spotify has done. So we'll see.
And those guys don't like each other. Those guys do not like each other. So if there's anyone who could spur Apple into taking action, I mean, whether it's some of the hires that they've made, on the Podcore engineering side, or if you look to see Zach Hahn, who is very good at doing podcast promotion for Vox, moved over there to work on their podcast PR and comms team. Yeah, I mean, I think you see moves here and there. You see the Bloomberg story over the summer, their announcement of doing original content around the Apple Plus shows. It's interesting too, because the stories have been sort of all over the value chain map, right? So it's not just one kind of story. Oh, Apple's going to do content, or Apple's just going to do engineering, or Apple's just going to do marketing and promotion. It's like a panoply of different things that they're doing. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. They are taking action. God bless. It's good.
So
good for the industry that they do that.
And we know our Apple friends listen to the show. So because we often get little something is said at an event or something. So, Rob and I think both have taken the point, having been in the space from the beginning when there was no app, when we were iPodder and just a few rudimentary apps that were allowing us to sync to an iPod or another, device. I don't know where my little device is. It had 256K of memory. Right here it is. I keep it here as a reminder of where we were before.
Yes, I remember that device.
Windows Media Player.
I had a Rio. Right. If you guys remember, it was 128K.
Right. So I think I could put like 6 or 7 episodes on there. But anyway, we would not be here without them today. That's just a simple fact. And I like it when we see new apps come on the space and there's new competition and give different ways of doing things. And I know it's very, very hard. I know you guys probably look at the numbers and say, "Oh man, I wish we could gain some more percentage points." It's hard. I understand. I don't envy what you folks have to do and to continue to build brand and continue to get your app out there. It's tough because when it comes on the phone, a lot of people don't go look anywhere else. But at the same point, you mentioned Google, and if anyone has the ability to really change the space, and all they have to do is add audio or podcast. Go to google.com and all they need is to have a button on there like they do now for images that says podcast.
Todd, they used to have that.
I know, but if that was ever to be put up there as a not a parent, but I know not a child, but a parent linking on that page, it could change a whole bunch of stuff. But at the same point, the strategy for Android so far has been horrible. But they're faced with OEMs that they have to negotiate every app that gets put on an Android phone. So what do they? They've got Gmail, they've got their 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 app, but just to get one more, it's a major deal over there, and you won't see that trickle out into 3, 4, 5 years because these deals are so. Google's got a ways to go, but they could really change the Android game. And the Android listeners, we know the Android listeners are missing in action in many instances, and it's partly the podcasters' fault as much as it is Google's fault.
A lot of the problem is that a lot of the Android phones are fairly limited in their resources in those devices. Yeah. So there's a lot of sensitivity to preloading content.
Well, preloading apps. What is when you get an Apple phone, you know what you're getting. They own that, and Google doesn't own all the phones. They can't tell Samsung. Samsung does its preload, and then Google has to fight their OEM apps that go on there, and that's why I think we haven't had an OEM podcast app from Google that automatically delivered on the devices.
Yeah, and in micro, you've just described the macro reason for why Apple is the most valuable consumer brand on planet Earth, which is that they own the entire value chain.
Right.
And they have been very good stewards. I think I got my first iPhone. It was the iPhone 3, which was technically the second model. And I've never looked back. The devices work. It's a great product. I am Skyping to you from a MacBook Pro. I'm an Apple fanboy. I'm wearing AirPods, right? So, their stuff just works, and they own the entire value chain. And with Google, it's quite a different platform. Right. So it's a little bit apples and oranges, but it's not just that they've owned these platforms and been good stewards of them. It's also that they have been, as a company, very focused on creativity and creators. Whether we're talking about, the fact that in their lean years in the '90s, graphic designers still loved using Macs. To the fact that so many musicians use Macs to compose. You name it. So many podcasters have always used Macs for obvious reasons. They are absolutely the reason we're all here, and there would be no Pocket Cast was it for Apple.
Owen, if you think about this too, let's say in 2 years, Google says, "Hey, we've got this new API." And Pocket Cast, you can tap into that API, and what we're going to give you access to is contextual search results for all index podcasts that we went through. And so if someone wants to find a snippet on a Rayovac AA battery, this is a stupid example, but you're going to find someone talking about a Rayovac AA battery, and you're going to find that show. And I think Google has the opportunity, and number one, will they open that up to you to let you tap it? And number two, will they keep that contained and try to move the space as if Spotify has a little bit here? So I don't know. We'll see, but I think
it depends which part of Google you ask, right?
Right. But they are the 800-pound gorilla. They could kill us all in an instant. So we could all be out of business. Or at least the hosting companies could be. We wouldn't go out of business today, but it would be very ugly in a few years. So we'll see.
We are all rounding errors of rounding errors for these people. There's no question.
Right, we are.
And we have lots. We have lots of friends both at Apple and Google who've been extremely supportive of what we're doing with Pocket Cast. And I've worked with some of the guys in the App Store, like going back to the very, very beginning of the App Store, going back to 2008.
But at the same time, you're like, I know what they're capable of.
Right.
Exactly.
And why are they doing this? Right. Hey, I wanted to just change the subject a little bit in the last few minutes that we have on the show and talk a little bit about premium as well as donation models as it relates to your listening platform and your thinking on those areas.
So as it pertains to paywall content, I think the jury's still out only because the medium still has so much headroom to grow in terms of the onboarding listeners into the app. I think the last data that we saw from the Edison research was that just about 50% of Americans had ever listened to podcasts, and 33-ish%, something like that, were listening regularly, right? So there's still a lot of headroom for the industry to become broadly adopted, for the medium to become, I should say, broadly adopted. And I don't think you want to be slicing and dicing the business up into little Bantustans of, some content here, some content's there, while there's still so much growth. And also the medium has had a strong and rich tradition of all of the content being available for free. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't create some premium models as long as they're not the only thing that you're doing. I think of Wondery Plus, or I even think of Stitcher, what they're doing, and I see that as smart market research about where the industry is heading. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think they should be doing that. They should be thinking about different business models, different way to transact with listeners. There's some listeners who will have no or very little willingness to pay. There's some listeners who will have a very high willingness to pay based on their emotional engagement with the content, right? And understanding the difference between those different listeners, I think, is really critical. And you're remiss, in your responsibility in the space if you're not thinking about that, because I know we are. On the donation side, obviously there are a lot of platforms that are already supporting those use cases. And what I would say is that we see north of 15% of all of the subscribed feeds inside of our app are for paid or private feeds, right? And half of that 15% right off the top, no surprise to anybody, is Patreon, right? But there's also, there's also Slate Plus in there. There's also Stitcher. There's a whole bunch of other players who are in there, right? But we already know that listeners are using our app to access paid and private feed. And then the last thing I'll just mention is, obviously, our partners are public media, and they're thinking about how you create, scalable digital membership and podcast membership options for engaged listeners. And we want to be part of helping to solve for some of those problems. I think what we need to figure out for ourselves in podcast is how much of the value chain is it appropriate for us to own. My current philosophy on this is, and this is something that we're all very dedicated to, the whole company is dedicated to, is making sure that for people who have opted in for paid and private feeds, right, that our experience is as seamless and user-friendly as possible, right? Because we're not going to be the top of the funnel. Right. We know that a lot of the listening is happening outside of our app. But once a listener decides to make that choice to opt in, lay down a credit card or some kind of payment of some kind, they should know that our app is going to just work seamlessly. And that's a real focus for us right now. We're actually working on that literally right now, making sure that that's as good and satisfying an experience as possible. And we're talking to every player you might expect about making sure that that's the case.
Yeah, because go ahead, Rob.
I was going to ask about the technical ways of doing that. Are you looking at supporting password protected access to media files using open RSS feeds, or are you looking at password protected RSS feed support, or what's your philosophy kind of moving forward with that?
Well, right now, the folks who we've had conversations with, with the exception of one of the players, and I'm not going to name names because they may feel like their technology is proprietary, what have you. But most of them are just basically using simple, separate RSS feeds for the private content, and everybody understands that there are issues
and it's all
with that.
Open. It's all open. It's not password protected.
Yeah.
It's just
so far,
unique feeds.
So far, there's one player in particular who I just had a conversation with, who actually is doing something where there is an authentication model of some kind. We don't want people to have like a web intent open up in their face and have it re-authenticate. We need to create a way, to recognize that user so that it's seamless, and that's something we would have to work on. But it's absolutely part of the conversation.
So more of probably a token-based relationship with a particular publishing platform, right? Okay.
Yeah, I don't like to be prescriptive. What I want to do is make sure that the solution doesn't add more complexity to the end user. So if tokens allow us to get there, great. Let's use some kind of token auth. If there's another kind of authentication methodology, I don't like to be prescriptive. I'm not the guy writing the code. We'll figure it out. It's just code.
Right. Yeah, when you get into those private podcasting solutions, it gets intimately complicated, including, there's 6 or 7 different matrices you can go down to on level of security. So the premium stuff is relatively easy. It's the other piece that's harder.
You know what I really like, though? I really like how many bright, thoughtful people are coming into the space and trying to think about this idea specifically. I mean, I just think of one example would be Amira Villani, who's at glow.fm. She's not the only example, but she's a really good example of someone who came into the industry for the right reasons, is trying to find the right kinds of partners, is trying to build a solution, is thinking about this in terms of community, not just in terms of dollars. She's just terrific, and I hope I'm wishing the very best for them. But that's just one example. I mean, she's in New York. It's easy for me to say that. I've spent time with her. But there's Red Circle. There's a whole bunch of folks who are trying to do good stuff. And I'm not here to try to pick a winner. I'm here to try to make the experience for the user as pleasant, right, and enjoyable and seamless as possible.
Rob, we got about 3 minutes left. Any last questions?
What's your thoughts on the overall growth of the podcasting medium? Are you feeling that we're going to see faster growth here in the next couple of years than we've seen over the prior couple of years? What's your kind of growth prediction on what's happening to the medium?
Do you want me to put my Tom Webster hat on? Shouts to Webster.
I do.
Where are you at, Webster?
He's probably watching. He's probably watching.
Webster.
He usually is.
Shouts. He knows I'm a fan. Well, I mean, if Tom's research is any indication, the velocity is increasing, and we all should be super, super excited. I think a lot of it is getting is moving from that place of awareness of the medium to, now I'm ready to actually try a podcast and go through the motions. Like, I read about it in the New York Times. I was just reading the Weekend Times before we jumped on this call. They just had a whole page in the art section about podcasts that they would like to, they just did an editorial piece about 8 or 10 podcasts. Everyone should check it out today in the Times. Support good journalism. And it wasn't even a big thing. It wasn't even like they had to explain to the listener what's a podcast and where you should. No, they're just like, here, a great podcast. This is great storytelling. Like, it was no big deal. I always look for indicators like that, in terms of, are we rounding the corner? So yes, the velocity, in my opinion, is increasing. For us, the trick is the top of the funnel is getting filled really quickly, but we sit further down the funnel. You're going to have to be really interested in the medium to want to take a look at us. So how quickly are those people who come in the top of the funnel graduating to being, advanced, passionate, really dedicated, really, really intellectually and emotionally engaged listeners.
The key is to give the podcasters something that makes them talk about your app on every single show.
So true.
Yeah, so that leads me to think that your philosophy in the medium is pushing you towards thinking of your app as the premium experience on the listening side. Is that
100%?
Is that
100%?
Okay, right.
100%. And not only that, you'll see something from us within the next couple of days. If you're a astute observer of our app, you go into our Discover section, maybe even Monday, and you take a look around. You'll see that we're rolling out some new features that are very listener focused in terms of how we present lists, guest lists, curation, so on. But also something that's very focused on meeting the needs of podcasters who are trying to match their content with the right audiences.
Right.
And we're really excited for that.
Exciting stuff. Well, I'm just absolutely thrilled you came on the show and Rob was able to make this connection with you and get you on, because really we don't get this perspective too much. We're always kind of complaining about it. And so it's nice to be, yeah, we're just like, why don't the app developers do this and do that? Or, and so it's good to have your perspective. But I want to thank you for coming on. Rob,
great fun.
Yeah, Owen, I don't know if you give out your exact contact details, but what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Anyone who wants to reach out, Owen at pocketcasts.com. So that's that simple. I mean, by the way, it's not hard to figure out anyway, because that's what we all use, just the first name and pocketcasts.com. And my Twitter handle, Twitter is a lot of fun. I'm not like, I'm not one of these yellers and screamers, but I enjoy thoughtful conversation. At Ogrover. And shout at me. I really enjoyed this, guys. You guys are both super thoughtful. I've been an admirer of Rob since his Zune days. Shouts to Zune. Great platform. Loved all my friends at Microsoft back in the day. And I really appreciate what you guys are doing and what you're standing for in the industry. So thanks so much for having me.
I appreciate it. Thanks for being on.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
All right, guys. Talk soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Well, that gives you something to think about.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So
yeah, I think I think we definitely need to get more of the listening side on this program to get their perspectives and get them involved. And
honestly, I don't spend a lot of time in all the apps. It's just yeah. And it's interesting. I've spent more times recently in apps than I have in others, but it is kind of a interesting time to see what's going on there. And I haven't looked to see what their market share is, but I hope he took to heart. If you give something to podcasters that they can rave about, it gives them information back. The podcasters will talk about it every single show because they want their listeners to be using that app because they're getting those insights. So
yeah, that's true. I mean, if Owen's Pocket Cast can create a better feature set listening experience than what Apple or Google's doing, I think that's their niche going forward.
Yeah. Mike says, isn't it time to plan for Mike Wilkerson, isn't it time to plan for the day the big boys slit throats? It's what's been needed in radio business for decades. So many people left in the lurch dead when they've outlived their usefulness. And, Mike, it's interesting because I had several calls this past week with people in radio, and radio's starting to realize, that I was predicting the radio had 10 to 15 years left. And I talked to somebody in the radio industry the other day, and they don't think it's got that much lifeline left. So I thought that was and it was a heavy duty industry person. So I thought that was interesting. And then I had to laugh about some other things I was told, but I'll keep that in confidence. But that radio doesn't get podcasting yet. So I don't think we have to worry about them completely yet, but they'll figure it out. And
it's almost, if you look at what's really happening is that the radio's creating separate divisions.
Yeah.
And radio's radio and podcasting's podcasting, and they're two separate mediums, and radio is definitely thinking like that. They may not be saying that publicly, but their actions speak louder than their words of sorts. And that's clearly what's happening.
Okay. So are we going to be back here next week?
No, what's
next
week?
I think we are.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, everyone, we'll be back here same time, same channel next Saturday at 12 Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern. Don't know what
Right.
we've got on top yet, but you can reach out to me, Todd at blueberry.com or at Geek News on Twitter.
Yeah. And you can find me on Twitter too at Rob Greenlee, and that's with 2 E's. And you can certainly reach out to me via email if you want, robg@libsyn.com.
And if you And if you've been on live today, make sure you say hello in the chat room. Just say hi. I was here. Thanks for listening. We want to know who you were if you're willing to divulge. But definitely appreciate everyone on today. So we'll see you next week on the new media show. Everyone take care.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.